In the early centuries of the Middle Ages, the knight in shining armor reigned supreme. Mounted on powerful war horses, clad in layers of chainmail and later plate, these warriors represented not only the military elite, but the very backbone of feudal society. For centuries, the image of the charging knight seemed unassailable. Yet from the shadows of Europe's towns, forests, and battlefields, two weapons emerged that would challenge this dominance: the crossbow and the longbow. The crossbow, though known to antiquity, began to spread across Europe around the 11th and 12th centuries. Compact, easy to learn, and terrifyingly powerful, it allowed even a common soldier with minimal training to send a bolt crashing through armor at short range. Its introduction struck fear into the hearts of the nobility. The knight's armor, once the guarantor of his survival, was suddenly vulnerable to the weapon of a peasant. The longbow, by contrast, was not a weapon of quick mastery. Rooted deeply in the traditions of Wales and later England, it demanded years of practice and immense physical strength. A skilled longbowman could unleash a storm of arrows with astonishing speed and accuracy, reaching targets at distances the crossbow could not dream of. Where the crossbow democratized death, the longbow created a professional corps of archers whose training shaped the destiny of kingdoms. Both weapons appeared against a backdrop of shifting military landscapes. By the High Middle Ages, battles were no longer the sole domain of mounted knights clashing in glorious charges. Cities were rising, infantry levies were expanding, and mercenary companies marched across Europe. The introduction of missile weapons into the core of military strategy reflected this transformation. Wars were no longer only about honor, but about numbers, logistics, and the efficiency of killing. The Church itself recognized the dangerous disruption of this new technology. At the Second Lateran Council in 1139, Pope Innocent II declared the use of crossbows against Christians to be hateful to God. Such a ban only confirmed the fear these weapons inspired. They stripped knights of their divine aura, reducing them to mortals vulnerable to a bolt fired by a lowly commoner. The longbow, though never formally condemned, carried a similar weight. Its presence at battles like Crécy and Agincourt would forever redefine the role of the mounted knight. The emergence of the crossbow and the longbow was more than a military development. It was a social revolution. These weapons symbolized the shifting power between classes. The knight, trained from birth and supported by wealth and land, could now be challenged by men drawn from villages and towns, armed with wood, sinew, and iron. The battlefield, once the stage for aristocratic glory, was becoming a place where commoners decided the fate of lords. Thus, as the 12th and 13th centuries progressed, Europe entered a new era of warfare. The clash was no longer simply between armies, but between traditions, the chivalric knight and the emerging power of missile troops. In this collision lay the seeds of a transformation that would echo across the centuries, paving the way for a world where nobility alone could no longer claim the monopoly of war. The rise of the crossbow and the longbow was the beginning of the end for the supremacy of the mounted knight. It was the first fracture in the myth of invincibility, a fracture that would widen at Crécy, Agincourt, and beyond. The crossbow was unlike any weapon the medieval battlefield had seen before. Its design was deceptively simple: a stock of wood, a bow of horn or steel, and a mechanism that held the string until released. But its power lay not in its elegance, but in its brutal efficiency. A crossbow could launch a short, heavy bolt with tremendous force, often enough to pierce chainmail and even early plate armor at close range. Where a longbow required years of practice, a crossbow could be mastered in weeks. A peasant pulled from the fields, handed this device, and drilled in the basics could suddenly become a deadly threat to the most powerful knight in Christendom. This accessibility gave the crossbow an almost revolutionary aura. In an age where warfare was considered the domain of the noble class, the crossbow leveled the field in ways that were deeply unsettling. The knight who had trained from childhood, who bore the cost of armor, horse, and lineage, might fall to a bolt loosed by a man of no rank, no heritage, no honor, merely a mercenary or levy. The crossbow stripped away centuries of chivalric pride with a pull of the trigger. The Church recognized this threat not only to the nobility, but to the very moral order of medieval society. At the Second Lateran Council in 1139, Pope Innocent II issued a decree condemning the use of crossbows and bows against Christians, declaring them hateful to God and unfit for holy war. It was a striking admission of how destabilizing the weapon had become. Yet the ban was largely ignored. War cared little for morality when survival was at stake. Kings and lords continued to employ crossbowmen, valuing their lethality over the protests of clerics. Nowhere was the crossbow's reputation more notorious than in the Mediterranean world. The Italian city-states, particularly Genoa, developed professional corps of crossbowmen whose skill was feared across Europe. These mercenaries hired out to the highest bidder, their bolts cutting down enemies in sieges, naval battles, and open fields alike. During the Crusades, Genoese crossbowmen were infamous for their discipline and deadly accuracy, a match even for the ferocity of Muslim cavalry. Yet the crossbow was not without limitations. Its rate of fire was painfully slow compared to the longbow. A skilled longbowman could shoot 6 or more arrows a minute. A crossbowman, depending on the mechanism, might only loose 1 or 2 bolts in the same span. Reloading required cranking with winches or hooks, leaving the soldier vulnerable. To compensate, crossbowmen often carried large shields called pavises, behind which they reloaded while comrades provided covering fire. Despite these drawbacks, the psychological effect of the crossbow was immense. Chronicles tell of knights struck down in their prime, their armor rendered useless by a weapon wielded by common hands. The fear of the crossbow spread like wildfire, shaping tactics and fortifications alike. To face a line of crossbowmen was to march into death itself, a reality that eroded the mystique of knightly invulnerability. In many ways, the crossbow embodied both progress and controversy. It was the weapon of equality, giving power to those once powerless. It democratized the act of killing, but in doing so, it stripped warfare of the honor and ritual that knights clung to so fiercely. It was a weapon born of necessity, embraced despite bans, and remembered as the first great challenger to the knight's supremacy. The age of the crossbow had begun. But in the forests and hills of England and Wales, another weapon was waiting to claim its place. A weapon more demanding, yet even more decisive: the longbow. If the crossbow was the weapon of accessibility, the longbow was its opposite, a weapon of endurance, discipline, and lifelong devotion. Standing as tall as the man who drew it, often 6 feet or more, the English longbow was crafted from the resilient heartwood and sapwood of the yew tree, its limbs combining strength with flexibility. To master it was to forge one's body into a living machine of war. Drawing a war bow often required pulling at weights of 120 to 160 pounds, an effort that demanded not only raw strength, but years of conditioning from boyhood. Unlike the crossbow, the longbow did not lend itself to quick training or casual use. Archers were bred, not made. In England and Wales, kings enforced laws that required practice in archery from a young age, turning fields and villages into training grounds. Over decades, this constant training transformed common men into specialists of astonishing power. Their skeletons bore the marks of their craft: warped spines, enlarged bones in the arms and shoulders, testimony to a lifetime of bending wood against muscle. The longbow's true terror lay in its speed. A seasoned archer could loose 6 to 10 arrows in a single minute, raining shafts upon enemy lines in relentless succession. Each arrow, though less likely than a crossbow bolt to penetrate heavy plate, carried deadly momentum at range, piercing chainmail, padded armor, and horses. Against unarmored troops or the flanks of cavalry, volleys of longbow arrows could shred formations before they ever reached melee. But the longbow was more than a weapon. It was a cultural icon. It embodied England's military identity during the 100 Years' War, becoming synonymous with the rise of English power on the continent. The battles of Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt were not simply won by kings and knights, but by the thousands of archers who darkened the sky with their arrows, rewriting the balance of war. Where the knight embodied aristocratic pride, the longbowman represented the strength of disciplined commoners standing shoulder to shoulder. Yet this weapon came with burdens. It required vast stores of yew, leading to widespread importation from across Europe. Training longbowmen consumed years and resources, making them a national investment rather than a mercenary asset. This contrasted sharply with the crossbow, whose soldiers could be raised and fielded quickly. The longbow was, in essence, the product of an entire society committed to its cultivation. The battlefield impact of the longbow was both tactical and psychological. French knights, proud and fearless, charged headlong into storms of arrows only to be felled by the hundreds. Chroniclers speak of arrows lodged so thickly in the ground that they formed barriers of wood and steel. Horses panicked under fire, formations broke, and once invincible cavalry crumbled under the weight of peasant archers' fury. In the longbow, England found a weapon that combined national identity with battlefield dominance. It was not merely a tool of war, but a symbol of collective strength, endurance, and defiance. Unlike the crossbow, which undermined the nobility through ease of use, the longbow reshaped the very fabric of English society by binding its people to a culture of martial readiness. Thus, as the 14th century unfolded, Europe witnessed a clash not only of weapons but of philosophies. The pragmatic crossbow, available to all, against the demanding longbow, the pride of England. Together, these weapons would conspire to bring down the knight, the armored lord of the Middle Ages, on the muddy fields of France. On the fields near the small village of Crécy in northern France, the clash between chivalric tradition and the new age of missile warfare reached its first thunderous crescendo. It was August 26, 1346. Edward III of England, outnumbered and deep in hostile territory, faced the might of King Philip VI's French host. The French army was vast, boasting heavily armored knights, noble banners fluttering proudly, and contingents of mercenary crossbowmen from Genoa. By all accounts, the French should have crushed the English invaders. Instead, Crécy became a blood-soaked lesson in the death of knightly supremacy. Edward had chosen his ground with the precision of a commander who understood the value of terrain. The English army took position on a slope with natural obstacles on the flanks, forcing the French to attack uphill into a narrow killing zone. Behind wooden palisades and makeshift defenses, thousands of English longbowmen stood ready. Each archer had planted his stake into the earth, forming a defensive line of sharpened points that would break cavalry charges. The field had been transformed into a trap. As the French advanced, they unleashed their Genoese crossbowmen in a skirmish line. The mercenaries were formidable, their weapons capable of piercing mail at shorter ranges. But on that day, fate betrayed them. The sky had been heavy with rain before the battle, soaking the crossbow strings. Unlike the longbow, whose hemp strings could be removed and kept dry, the crossbows lost much of their tension and power. Worse, the Genoese were forced to face a relentless barrage of arrows from the longbowmen above them. Within moments, chaos erupted. The English archers, firing at a rate the crossbowmen could not hope to match, cut them down mercilessly. Their advance stalled, bolts fell short, and soon the Genoese began to retreat. Infuriated, the French knights, seeing their mercenaries in disarray, charged forward to restore honor to the field. What followed was carnage. Wave after wave of French cavalry thundered uphill into storms of arrows. Horses screamed and collapsed, men fell crushed beneath their mounts, and armored knights, weighed down by steel, stumbled in the mud. Chroniclers tell us that the arrows fell so thickly that they darkened the sky, a relentless rain of death. The longbow's strength was not in a single arrow, but in thousands unleashed together, overwhelming even the most armored foe. The French nobility, bound by honor and tradition, refused to retreat. Again and again they hurled themselves into the arrow storm, and again they were repelled, their ranks thinning, their pride bleeding into the soil. The battlefield became a slaughterhouse, strewn with broken lances, shattered bodies, and discarded banners. Among the dead lay nobles, counts, and even the blind King John of Bohemia, who had tied himself to his knights and charged to his doom in a final act of chivalric defiance. By the battle's end, thousands of French knights and men-at-arms lay dead, while English losses were astonishingly light. Crécy proved beyond doubt that the longbow was not merely a weapon, it was a revolution. It shattered the myth of invincible cavalry, proving that disciplined archers could annihilate even the most glorious charges. For Europe, Crécy was more than a defeat. It was a revelation. The knight, once the unchallenged master of the battlefield, was now prey to common men wielding bows of yew. The shock of this transformation rippled through courts and castles, forcing rulers to reconsider tactics, armies, and the very structure of war. The world of medieval chivalry had been pierced as surely as French armor by English arrows. Nearly 70 years after Crécy, the lesson should have been learned. Yet on October 25, 1415, the fields near Agincourt bore witness to another catastrophic clash between knightly pride and the deadly efficiency of English archers. Henry V of England, his army exhausted from weeks of campaigning, faced overwhelming French numbers. The French host, boasting thousands of armored knights and men-at-arms, outnumbered the English by as much as 4-1. To most observers, the English king and his weary, sickly troops seemed doomed. But the longbow would once again tilt the balance of fate. The field at Agincourt was narrow, flanked by thick woods that hemmed in the French. Days of heavy rain had turned the ground into a quagmire. These conditions, mud, bottlenecks, and constrained space, were disastrous for cavalry and heavy infantry, but ideal for Henry's defensive strategy. His archers, some 5,000 strong, drove sharpened stakes into the ground to form a bristling barrier against mounted charges, and then they took their places in formation. Behind them stood the thin line of English men-at-arms, ready to hold the line should the French break through. As the battle began, the French knights advanced, confident in their numbers and eager to crush the outnumbered foe. But each step forward brought misery. Arrows rained down in sheets, loosed with relentless speed and deadly precision. The muddy terrain slowed their progress, horses floundered, and knights stumbled under the weight of water-soaked armor. The English longbowmen, protected by their stakes and firing in disciplined volleys, transformed the battlefield into a killing ground. The French cavalry charged again and again, only to collapse against walls of arrows. Horses screamed, men toppled, and chaos spread through the advancing ranks. Behind them, French infantry pressed forward, driving their own men into the mud, where they became trapped, trampled, and suffocated. Chroniclers tell of knights drowning in their armor, unable to rise from the muck as comrades fell atop them in heaps. What was meant to be a display of chivalric might devolved into a suffocating massacre. Henry V himself waded into the thick of the fighting, rallying his men with cries of defiance. The English, fighting for survival, carved through disoriented foes. The longbowmen, once their arrows were spent, dropped bows and rushed forward with mallets, knives, and hatchets, slaughtering armored men pinned helplessly in the mire. It was not noble combat, but brutal efficiency, born of desperation and the will to live. By battle's end, French losses were staggering. Thousands of knights, nobles, and men-at-arms lay dead, including many of the highest aristocracy of France. The English losses were shockingly light in comparison. Agincourt echoed Crécy's lesson, but with even greater resonance. Knightly valor, heavy armor, and overwhelming numbers meant little against terrain, discipline, and the storm of the longbow. The psychological impact of Agincourt was immense. The flower of French chivalry had been cut down, not in glorious duels but in mud, filth, and ignominy, overwhelmed by common archers. It marked the definitive humiliation of the knightly ideal, proving once more that the age of armored cavalry was crumbling under the relentless advance of missile weapons and changing tactics. Agincourt became legend, immortalized in chronicles and Shakespeare's verse, but beyond its romance lay a brutal truth. The battlefield no longer belonged to the knight. It belonged to those who wielded range, numbers, and discipline, the common men with bows who had brought down the noblest warriors of Europe. If the longbow wrote its legend in the mud of France, the crossbow carved its reputation in the bustling cities of Italy and the holy battlegrounds of the Crusades. Unlike the longbow, whose strength lay in national tradition and long years of training, the crossbow became the weapon of mercenaries, professionals, and city militias. Its impact was no less transformative, and its story is one of commerce, innovation, and fear. In the Italian city-states, Genoa, Pisa, and Venice, the crossbow was more than a weapon. It was a craft. Skilled artisans produced mechanisms of remarkable precision, combining wood, horn, sinew, and later steel to create deadly instruments of war. Genoa, in particular, became synonymous with crossbowmen, training soldiers whose services were so prized they were hired across Europe. These men did not fight out of loyalty to kings or lords, but for pay, and their discipline made them formidable on the battlefield. The reputation of Genoese crossbowmen spread far and wide. In the Mediterranean, they manned the galleys of their cities, loosing bolts from behind wooden shields at sea. On land, they served as shock troops in sieges and pitched battles. Their bolts could smash through shields and armor, devastating infantry formations and cavalry alike. Where the longbow needed decades of preparation, the crossbow gave cities and rulers a weapon that could be deployed quickly and efficiently, provided one had the coin to hire its masters. The Crusades brought the crossbow to a wider stage. In the holy wars of the 11th through 13th centuries, Christian and Muslim armies clashed in brutal encounters across the Levant. The crossbow was feared and loathed by both sides. Muslim chroniclers spoke of its terrifying power, while European sources reveal both reliance on and unease with the weapon. For Crusader castles besieged in the baking sun of Outremer, the crossbow became a vital defender's tool, sending bolts crashing into enemy ranks and buying precious time against overwhelming odds. But with its power came infamy. To the Church, the crossbow seemed almost unholy, a weapon that allowed common men to slaughter nobles with ease, stripping warfare of the order it once claimed to uphold. The papal ban of 1139, though largely ignored, revealed the anxiety of a world in which the crossbow had broken the monopoly of violence once reserved for the knightly class. Its spread represented not just a military shift, but a moral one, undermining the hierarchy of medieval society. Tactically, the crossbow shone in sieges. Whether assaulting or defending, it excelled at close-range lethality. Crossbowmen behind pavises, towering shields carried into position, formed walls of death from which bolts flew with deadly accuracy. In urban conflicts, such as those between Italian communes, the crossbow was king. Narrow streets and fortified gates turned battles into deadly contests of precision shooting, where the knight's horse and lance meant little, yet its limitations remained. Slow to reload and vulnerable in open fields, crossbowmen needed protection and coordination. When unsupported, as at Crécy, they could be massacred by faster-firing longbowmen. Still, in the fragmented wars of Italy and the brutal sieges of the Crusader states, the crossbow proved indispensable. In this way, the crossbow became a weapon of pragmatism. It was not bound by tradition or honor, but by results. It belonged to mercenaries, militias, and commanders who valued effectiveness over chivalry. Where the longbow reshaped England's military identity, the crossbow reshaped the conduct of war itself, turning it from the stage of knights into the domain of professionals. Thus, in the cities of Italy and the deserts of the Levant, the crossbow earned its reputation. A weapon feared by kings, condemned by popes, and wielded by those who understood that victory, not honor, decided the fate of nations. The knight had long stood as the living symbol of medieval hierarchy, wealth, power, and divine favor encased in armor, mounted on a warhorse worth a peasant's lifetime of labor. But the crossbow and the longbow shattered that image. For the first time in centuries, a man born with no title, no horse, and no land could bring down a noble with a single well-aimed shot. It was not only a military revolution, it was a social earthquake. In feudal Europe, violence was supposed to flow downward. Nobles fought, peasants labored. Warfare was the noble's prerogative, bound by codes of chivalry that glorified jousts, duels, and the honor of combat between equals. Yet on the battlefield, missile weapons cared nothing for honor. A knight who had trained from childhood, whose lineage stretched back generations, could fall to a peasant with a bow or a mercenary wielding a crossbow. To the chroniclers of the age, this was nothing short of scandalous. The resentment of the nobility toward these weapons was palpable. Crossbowmen, in particular, were seen as dishonorable killers. Their anonymity on the battlefield denied knights the opportunity for noble combat. A knight slain by another knight could at least claim honor in death. A knight felled by a crossbow bolt or a longbow arrow died like any other man. This equality in death horrified a class that defined itself by difference. For peasants, however, missile weapons opened new possibilities. Though often still bound to their lords, those chosen or trained as archers gained a degree of respect and value that their farming brethren did not. In England, the longbow turned commoners into the decisive arm of the military. Laws requiring practice elevated archery from pastime to civic duty, binding peasant identity to national defense. At Crécy and Agincourt, the victories of longbowmen were not just English triumphs. They were triumphs of common men over aristocratic might. The crossbow, meanwhile, democratized lethality across Europe. Italian city militias armed with crossbows could hold their own against mounted nobles. Mercenary companies, staffed by men who fought for coin rather than bloodline, transformed warfare into a marketplace of death. The knight's monopoly on violence was broken, and with it, the social order began to shift. Of course, these changes were not welcomed by those in power. Attempts to regulate or ban these weapons reflected a desperate effort to restore control. Yet the genie could not be put back in the bottle. Once peasants and townsmen had been armed with weapons that could humble nobles, the battlefield was forever changed. Even if political and social structures took centuries to evolve, the seeds of transformation had been sown in mud and blood. The psychological impact was equally profound. The knight's aura of invulnerability, so carefully cultivated through tales of chivalry and divine sanction, was stripped away. No matter how glorious the armor, no matter how noble the charge, a simple shaft of wood or a quarrel of steel could end it all in an instant. The symbolism was devastating. Death did not discriminate between lord and laborer when delivered from a bowstring. Thus, the rise of missile weapons was more than military innovation. It was the quiet rebellion of the lower classes, waged not in proclamations or revolts, but in volleys of arrows and bolts. It marked the slow decline of feudal privilege, a shift that would eventually give rise to the armies of early modern Europe, where common soldiers, not just aristocratic knights, would decide the fate of kings. If the open battlefield revealed the power of bows and crossbows against knights, the grim art of siege warfare displayed their versatility even more vividly. Castles, walled towns, and fortified keeps defined medieval Europe. They were symbols of power and strongholds of resistance, and to capture or defend them was often more decisive than victory in the field. Here, the crossbow and the longbow proved indispensable, reshaping the way wars of stone and mortar were fought. From the ramparts of castles, defenders rained death upon attackers with unrelenting precision. Crossbowmen, crouched behind crenellations or firing through narrow arrow slits, sent bolts hurtling into siege lines. The mechanical force of the crossbow was particularly useful in these scenarios. Its power made every shot count, even at close quarters, where attackers pressed ladders against walls or sought to undermine gates. For attackers, the same weapon became a tool of harassment, suppressing defenders as engineers worked with rams, towers, and mines. The longbow, with its unmatched rate of fire, played a different but equally crucial role. From behind parapets or on open ground, volleys of arrows disrupted enemy formations before they could approach the walls. During prolonged sieges, longbowmen could keep up a withering fire that exhausted enemy morale and inflicted constant attrition. Their arrows might not always pierce the thickest armor, but they harried the unarmored masses, sappers, camp followers, and lighter infantry, whose labor sustained the besieging army. Sieges were, above all, wars of patience, and bows excelled in sustaining pressure. In the Crusader states, where castles like Crac des Chevaliers and Carac rose as titans of stone, crossbows became the favored weapon of defenders. Chronicles describe bolts so numerous they fell like hail, keeping Saracen forces at bay. In response, Muslim archers returned fire with their own composite bows, creating deadly exchanges that could last for hours across the walls. Mercenary crossbowmen became indispensable in Italy's city-states, where urban warfare blurred the line between battle and siege. In places like Florence and Milan, where rival factions clashed, narrow streets became killing zones where crossbows dominated. Pavises, large shields carried into position, turned alleys into fortified lines from which bolts were loosed in steady rhythm. The clash of factions was less about cavalry charges and more about precision shots fired from behind wood and stone. The psychological toll of missile weapons in sieges was immense. Imagine toiling in a trench, only to hear the deadly hiss of a bolt or arrow finding its mark among comrades. Imagine climbing a ladder, your heart pounding, only to be struck down before you even glimpsed the battlements above. The constancy of danger wore down morale long before walls were breached. For besieged defenders, it was equally nerve-wracking to live under the perpetual threat of arrows whistling over walls, striking without warning, day after day. Tactically, bows and crossbows became tools of coordination with siege engines. As catapults and trebuchets battered walls, archers and crossbowmen suppressed defenders, ensuring engineers could work without interruption. Likewise, defenders timed volleys to break assaults, striking down men as they clustered beneath walls or attempted to storm gates. Without bows, sieges might drag interminably. With them, the pace of death quickened, and the balance tilted toward whichever side maintained control of missile fire. In this context, the bow and the crossbow were not simply weapons, they were force multipliers, amplifying the effectiveness of other siege tactics. They turned static walls into dynamic killing zones and made the business of conquest or defense far more costly. The knight on horseback was of little use here. It was the archer on the wall, the crossbowman behind a pavis, who determined whether a siege would end in triumph or starvation. Thus, in the shadow of castles and city gates, the true revolution of missile weapons unfolded. They shifted the very meaning of power in medieval Europe. No fortress was invincible, and no knight, no matter how noble, was beyond the reach of an arrow loosed from afar. By the late Middle Ages, a new sound began to echo across Europe's battlefields, a sound unlike the twang of bowstrings or the hiss of arrows. It was the thunderous crack of gunpowder. What began as a curiosity imported from China slowly evolved into the most transformative force in European warfare. The rise of firearms would render both crossbow and longbow obsolete, forever altering the balance of power between knights, common soldiers, and kings. At first, gunpowder weapons were crude. Early hand cannons of the 14th century were little more than metal tubes mounted on wooden stocks, ignited by slow matches. They were dangerous to use, inaccurate, and agonizingly slow to reload. Yet even in these primitive forms, they offered something neither the longbow nor the crossbow could: sheer penetrative force that increased with each refinement of powder and shot. A bullet did not rely on years of training or mechanical tension. With time and improvement, it promised to pierce any armor. For knights, this was catastrophic. The longbow had already proven that armored cavalry could be humbled under storms of arrows, but the knight still had a fighting chance if he closed the distance. Firearms removed even that slim advantage. As handguns grew more efficient in the 15th and 16th centuries, no thickness of plate could guarantee survival. The knight's shining armor, once the pinnacle of military technology, became a death trap against bullets that struck with bone-shattering impact. The spread of gunpowder also changed the economics of war. Training a longbowman required years, sometimes decades. Maintaining corps of crossbowmen still demanded expense in equipment and coordination. By contrast, firearms could be taught in weeks. A peasant who might once have been handed a pike or crude spear could now wield a musket with devastating effect. Armies no longer needed to invest a lifetime of resources into an archer. They needed powder, shot, and drill. In sieges, firearms accelerated a revolution already underway. Cannons tore down castle walls once thought impregnable, shattering stone with relentless bombardment. The crossbowman behind his pavis, the archer on the battlements, both became vulnerable as artillery turned fortresses into rubble. Cities and lords alike had to rethink defense, giving rise to the star forts and angled bastions of the Renaissance. The age of the medieval castle, like the age of the armored knight, was ending. Still, for a time, bows and crossbows coexisted with firearms. In the 15th century, Swiss crossbowmen fought alongside emerging gunners, and English archers remained valuable assets even as handguns appeared on the continent. Yet their days were numbered. Each generation of firearm grew more reliable, and each battlefield proved that the gun's simplicity outweighed the elegance of bows. By the 16th century, armies across Europe were transitioning to gunpowder as their primary missile weapon. This shift was not only technological, but social. Firearms further empowered central monarchies, who could now raise standing armies of gunmen beholden to the crown rather than to feudal lords. Warfare ceased to be the privilege of a knightly elite or the domain of long-trained archers. It became the business of states, of mass levies equipped with weapons that required obedience more than skill. For the knight, the crossbow had been the first crack in his armor, the longbow the breaking storm. But it was the firearm that delivered the coup de grace. The thunder of gunpowder, once heard, could not be silenced. It heralded not only the end of medieval warfare, but the birth of the modern age. For centuries, the knight had been more than a soldier. He was the embodiment of feudal order, a figure wrapped in steel and sanctity, astride a warhorse bred for battle. To kill a knight was not only to defeat an enemy, but to strike at the very heart of medieval hierarchy. And yet by the close of the Middle Ages, the knight as master of the battlefield was gone. But who, or what, had truly killed him? The crossbow dealt the first blow. Its simplicity and raw power stripped away the exclusivity of combat. A peasant, armed with wood, sinew, and a steel bolt, could undo a man who had trained from birth and borne the cost of armor and horse. The weapon horrified the nobility precisely because it was so democratic. No lineage or valor could stop a quarrel loosed from a mercenary's bow. The longbow delivered the second. Unlike the crossbow, it was not a tool of mercenaries but of nations. It transformed the common men of England into a corps of disciplined warriors whose arrows humbled the greatest cavalry charges in Christendom. Crécy and Agincourt were not accidents of weather or terrain alone. They were monuments to the power of collective training and relentless volleys of yew-bows. The longbow turned the knight's pride into mud-soaked tragedy. But weapons alone did not seal the knight's fate. The social shifts they represented mattered just as much. Peasants, townsmen, and mercenaries entered the stage of war, wielding tools that made them decisive players. The monopoly of violence, once claimed by the aristocracy, crumbled. Knights could no longer dictate the terms of battle when common soldiers could topple them from afar. Gunpowder, however, wrote the final chapter. The firearm was the executioner of the knightly class. Where crossbows and longbows could be blunted by armor or countered by tactics, the gun promised inevitability. It was easier to train, devastating in power, and scalable for mass armies. Armor grew heavier, then vanished. Horses became liabilities. The knight, once the terror of fields and fortresses, became obsolete in the face of bullets and cannonballs. Yet to say that weapons alone killed the knight would be to miss the larger truth. The knight was undone by a convergence, by changing economies that favored standing armies over noble levies, by shifting politics that centralized authority under kings rather than lords, by the rise of cities and money economies that paid for mercenaries and gunners. The crossbow and longbow were tools of this transformation. The firearm ensured its permanence. What truly killed the knight was not only the bolt, the arrow, or the bullet, it was history itself. The age of chivalric dominance gave way to the age of mass warfare, professional soldiers, and monarchs commanding centralized power. The knight, who had once believed himself the anointed lord of war, found himself a relic of a fading order. Yet in death, the knight lived on. His image endured in romance, in poetry, in the pages of chivalric tales, and the imagination of later centuries. But on the battlefield, he was finished, not by dishonor, but by inevitability. The tools of common men, sharpened by necessity and amplified by innovation, had claimed his crown. And so the question, Who really killed the knight finds its answer in many hands. The peasant with his crossbow, the English archer with his longbow, the gunner with his matchlock. But above all, it was the tide of change that no lance could shatter, no shield could block, and no armor could withstand.